I started into this profession 33 years ago, and people ask me over that span of time how many projects I've been able to complete. And I think the last time I counted was in the year 2000, and at that point, we counted over 100, mostly parks and public buildings. So the second question I always get is, out of those pieces, what projects do you think are the most important? And the projects that I think are the most important aren't always the ones that get the most publicity, but to me, the ones that are most meaningful would be the Mount Pisgah Memorial, Rosa Parks, and the Marist project.
Our hope as a committee and as a school was that we would be able to create something that captured the tone of Marist: faith and community and education.
They had driven to Portland, and they had seen a sculpture at the University of Portland called Jesus as Teacher, and they wanted to know if I could do something similar for Marist.
And I will just never forget him saying, "Oh, I don't do Christ." And we all took a deep breath, because that is a profound statement when you think about, well, first of all, there are no pictures of Jesus, and secondly, to try to capture the nature of God made man, unbelievably holy, special, loving. How does one capture that?
I would be making a decision of what Jesus looked like, and as soon as you make Jesus one particular image, you eliminate 1,000 other possibilities. I like what resides in that other 1,000 possibilities.
We didn't want statues up on pedestals. We wanted a community feel, an interactive sculpture, something that people could relate with. We came on the idea that we settled with, which was, well, let's bring students and a teacher and a symbol or a piece of our faith background together in a grouping.
And so we decided to do something about the founding of Marist by the brothers. And one of the faculty members said, Brother Nan, who was a very iconic figure at Marist for over 20 years, had a powerful shaping influence on countless lives, visits Eugene and visits Marist every year from Florida, where he's now living, and maybe we could use him as one of the models.
It was actually Monsignor Murnane. He was the pastor at St. Mary's, and so he was the one that spearheaded the actual building of Marist High School, and asked the Marist brothers back in, I don't know what year it was, maybe 65, to come out and staff along with the Sisters of the Holy Name. We just opened the school in Illinois, Chicago, so to go another 2,000 miles was very adventurous. I was young enough, I was 29, so I jumped at the opportunity to come out, and I taught 1 year at St. Francis. There was nothing around the school except farms, and we resided in mobile homes at the time, 3 units, 24 by 60. So in the evening, in the spring and the summer, all you would hear would be the rainbirds going off irrigating the land. Then there were sheep out here in the fields. Where these homes are in the front was an apple orchard. There was a farm we had to chase cows off the football field because they broke through the fence. So it was a real farming region. I'll put it this way, that being here from the very beginning and seeing the growth, you become part of that growth, to the point where you may say it's like raising a child. You see the individual grow and mature and come out with a product that reflects the institution itself. So my heart is here, and as I said earlier, I'd come back in a heartbeat.
I was working on Brother Dan when Megan Bro was assigned to take some photographs, and she walked into the room, and I thought she was about the right size. She was an engaged student in that she was very attentive to the task that she was given.
He was telling me what the project was and how they were going to need students, and then all of a sudden he just goes, you know, you'd kind of be perfect for the girls or the female student. Would you be interested in modeling for it? And I was like, why not? You know, when else am I going to be a bronze statue? I would go out to his house every day for a solid month, and I would sit there and he would take measurements and sculpt things out, and he'd kind of take a look at me and then look at the statue and kind of be like, no, that doesn't look right, and like scratch it and start over. It was really interesting because most of the work he did was like literally just with his hands and a butter knife, and like didn't have a lot of modeling tools, and it was just kind of crazy to me to see the whole process and how much effort he puts into it. Yeah, I would work in about hour and a half increments, and then he'd let me have a break, and then we'd go back at it for a little bit, and then I'd go back the next morning and do it all again. I think kind of when the body started getting all the clothes on it, and I was sitting there wearing the clothes right next to it, and how it fell on myself and how it fell on the statue was just so similar that it was almost creepy at certain points, because it like was literally the curves of my shirt, and how I was sitting was how it looks now.
We needed a teacher, and the Marist teachers are teaching when I'm working, so that was going to be a little difficult. Plus, if I took one teacher at Marist, then there's a whole bunch that others that don't get chosen, you know. And so we weren't sure how to do this. Well, I had a friend, Kara, who was finishing up some work at University of Oregon, and her background or her interest was Old English literature. And what I found interesting about Kara is when she would talk about Old English literature, she would have this sort of bubbling enthusiasm for the subject. So I thought that would be a great sort of expressive face for a teacher at Marist. When we started the project with Brother Dan, we decided to work at Marist so that the students could come in and see sort of how the process of sculpture works from start to finish. So we found an area on the stage and put up an armature and started packing clay. I had Brother Dan come in every day in his cassock, and he would stand there and I would pack clay around and we would talk, and eventually it started taking shape. Once I had the sculpture looking like Brother Dan, then the task is to cut the sculpture apart and make molds of the arms, the head, things that you can detach and make good detailed molds of. You do that. You know, one of the things we did is we took the head of Brother Dan into the art room, and we had the art classes watch as I poured wax into those molds. And the wax cooled, and I broke the molds apart, and I had a positive image of Brother Dan. Then you start building the larger piece molds of the cassock itself. We basically start at the bottom of the figure, work towards the top in sections. Each section of mold has to have a separator on it. So you put a Vaseline or sometimes a silicone separator so that you can get one section to break away from the other one without cracking in a place where you don't want it to crack. Then once you get the entire piece encased in plaster, then the reverse. You start taking all those pieces apart, pulling all the clay out. For people watching this process, they'll see the sculpture of Brother Dan in clay. It'll look like Brother Dan. Then I build the molds around it and pull the molds off. And in the process of pulling the molds off, I'm just pulling that clay apart and throwing it back in a bucket because I don't need it anymore. If somebody's there in the room, there's always an audible gasp when I do that because I think, oh no, he's ruining this sculpture. He spent all this time on this sculpture and now he's just throwing it in a bucket. But I've done the process so much that I know that Brother Dan still lives in those molds. I can get that image back anytime I want in the molds. You know, the first thing we set out to do is break the sculpture down, take all the molds, get them all laid out, clean them, and then we start reassembling the molds and filling them with wax. Once we have all the pieces out of the mold, then the task is to reassemble the sculpture in wax. And you want to reassemble it in wax, you want to get all those seams cleaned up. This is really your last chance to make fairly easy corrections to the sculpture. We go about sort of putting everything together, making sure it fits. Sometimes there's a little bit of warpage in the process of transferring it from the clay to the plaster to the wax, and the final wax sculpture gives you a chance to correct those things. Once it's then totally complete, I take the wax sculpture that I've got all together and I cut it apart in castable sections. Now, what I mean by castable sections is you can't cast a piece like this in one section. You have to break it apart. Most crucibles hold, under 200 pounds. Brother Dan weighed, the finished piece weighs over 500 pounds of bronze. We use an investment plaster, which is a high refractory castable plaster that is treated to withstand a lot of heat and a lot of pressure, because the temperature of the bronze we're going to pour into this thing is about 2100 degrees. It's pretty hot. So the entire wax pieces get covered, entirely immersed inside and out in this casting plaster. So this is the last stage of our mold building process. I have some chicken wire around the mold. This works as a rebar, and then I'm going to cover that chicken wire with another layer of plaster. So realize that if I'm pouring a 100-pound section, some plaster that's a half an inch thick is going to have to hold 100 pounds of weight. Not only 100 pounds of weight, but 2,100 degrees and 100 pounds. So we try to assure our greatest chances of success with using a rebar inside of those molds. Once the molds are completed, then I lift them into a burnout kiln. It's just like a ceramic kiln, only it doesn't have to reach the extreme temperatures that a ceramic kiln fires to. Cone 10 in ceramics is about 2,350 degrees. That's where a lot of stoneware pottery is fired. The burnout kiln in bronze casting is only about 900 to 1,000 degrees. That's the temperature where all the wax will have melted out of the molds, and all of the residue, all of the carbon will also totally burn out, so that the molds will be clean and white when you get ready to pour the bronze in. After we get the wax burned out of these molds, then we take the molds out and we bury them in a sand pit. One of the most fun, the most dramatic parts of the process of bronze casting is the actual pour. The blast furnace is the oven. It's sort of a blowtorch kind of affair. It's got propane and it's got forced air behind the propane fuel, which gives it sort of a torch effect. The torch wraps around the crucible, melts the bronze, heats it up to 2,100 degrees. Take a look. Good. It's clear?
Yeah.
Get it centered. Looks good. Got it? Okay, come off. So, one closest to me first. Here we go. Once the molds are cool enough to remove from the sandpit, we pull them out and we just start beating on them with a hammer, being careful not to go through the plaster and hit the bronze. But these are called waste molds because they get wasted in the process of freeing the sculpture. As you're doing this, you can see the parts, the faces, you can see them emerge from the plaster. It's really pretty interesting. It's like moment of creation or something. Then you hose them down, knock all the plaster off, see what you've got. And that's the rough casting. And that's where the next part of the process comes in. Then you clean the pieces up, dig all of the investment plaster out of the inside of the pieces, and you start thinking about how you're going to weld the parts together. You have to work to fit the pieces together. What I mean by that is every time we cast and the pieces are cooling, there's going to be a little bit of warpage. The bronze is going to move a little bit. Sometimes there'll be a little bit of flashing at the edges. That all has to be trimmed down just to give you the best possible fit. So that involves grinding, trying the piece to see if it fits, grinding a little more, putting it back on. You know, you can do that a dozen times before you get the exact fit that you want. Okay, that looks pretty good. You want a little bit of a gap so you have someplace for your weld to go. There's a point where it sort of emotionally starts picking up momentum because you can see that all you need is a couple more pieces and it can stand by itself. It'll start looking like the person. You can see how the gestures are going to work. You can see sort of the character that the bronze metal is going to give the person that you've sculpted. Then the task is to try to use grinders and sandpaper and polishers to hide the welds, to get the welds to be exactly the same texture as the original modeling of the sculpture. Usually you want something sort of dull that will take a fairly dark patina. And so we do that with sandblasting. And sandblasting is probably the part of the process which I find the least enjoyable because the sand gets everywhere and you have to wear a lot of protective gear and face shields and earplugs. And so that part of it's pretty obnoxious. But once you get through that part, then you move on to the patina part. And that, again, gets sort of interesting because that's where you bring the color out in the bronze. Now what you're doing with patina is you're forcing an oxidation process of the bronze. And bronze will oxidize by itself to a color that's similar to what you see in the European statues. It will do that by itself if you give it about 20 years. If you don't want to wait the 20 years, then you can mix up chemicals like ferric nitrate, You can work with the sulfurated potash in solution, and these will react with the bronze and actually force an oxidation on the surface of the metal. So it's not paint. You're actually changing the metal itself to bring out certain colors that give it more of a depth. Once the patina is finished, then the task is just, protecting the surface from dirt. Basically, you're trying to keep it vibrant. Bowling alley wax works pretty well because it's hard wax and it's got a lot of carnauba in it. I like to do a hot wax, which means I heat the pieces up with a torch and I get the surface of the bronze hot enough to actually melt the wax, so that when I put the wax on, that wax really soaks in to all the little crevices in the bronze and helps protect it. The final part of the process is installing the piece. And that usually takes a few big, strong bodies. And fortunately at Marist, we had a few. We recruited a few of the football players to come and help us, pick the pieces up out of the truck and move them onto the plaza.
There we go. Good. Okay, looking good, I think. Yes. Nice.
Oftentimes I find things in my work that I wish I'd have done differently, that I would like to change a little bit. Something that looks awkward and bothers me. Somebody else might not notice it, but if I notice it, it bothers me. On these pieces, there hasn't been much that I've noticed. There hasn't been anything major that I've seen that I would want to change.
Looking at the statue on the way up, it captures the spirit of togetherness, community.
It really explains the relationship, I think, between the faculty and staff and teachers with their students.
It has just been phenomenal how people have commented and said, wow, what a neat thing. And in fact, we laugh because once in a while they do double takes, like, is that a person over there?
What makes a project successful for me is not necessarily just whether the pieces resemble the people that you're trying to sculpt, because in 20 years, nobody's going to really know, and the models are going to change a lot in the next 20 years. So for me, what makes it successful is not just that it resembles somebody, but that it has sort of an expressive essence, the right gesture, the right spacing, that it communicates something beyond just resembling the people that you're using as models.
Students have been unbelievably inspired and touched, I think, by the statuary. So we're thrilled because it is going to be here for a long, long time for students and community to come.